Welcome to this episode of Nerds and Friends. Today, the guest is myself, with Caleb interviewing me about my new book, Galgathor's Gambit.
Woo!
Yeah.
So excited to talk to you about the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
I feel like some inspiration may have come from a D&D game that we played, a D&D campaign, which I am proud to have been a part of. But it was really cool to read like how the story developed in your mind, which was really, really cool. So Josh, like where did the idea for this come from?
The idea came from a long time ago. I don't remember exactly when. I was reading some articles about like pre-colonial Australia. And I loved your face there. And about how there were like giant lizards that they believe were roaming the outback at the same time as like a lot of the ancient Aborigine people, so that they had people at these large, like basically holdover from dinosaurs. And I was like, that's pretty awesome. So I started crafting a fantasy story. I was like, that'd make a cool fantasy setting. So that's how I started building Tazrelia, was kind of a fantasy version of pre-colonial Australia. And that's where the Taz tribes people come from, is based on the Aborigine people in Australia. And so, yeah, I just kind of went with that and had a culture along the coasts of like shipwreck survivors that build up cities, and just kind of built the world from there. And then the premise just kind of popped into my head of what could unite a bunch of interesting characters, and I was like, well, getting framed for murder, that'll do it. So
that'll unite them
for sure.
So like where, like, okay, I have so many questions. Like, how did you stumble across pre-colonial Australia articles?
Sometimes you just start reading about dinosaurs and you just kind of go down rabbit holes on Wikipedia, you know? It happens.
Oh my gosh.
I believe I think I was actually in Utah, traveling between here and Los Angeles, and I was at a hotel room just laying in bed, just Wikipedia scrolling when I read that. So I do believe, it was in Utah or Las Vegas, staying for that at a hotel on a road trip when I stumbled across that, if I remember correctly.
And so that just stayed with you all these years of the world that it could be.
I want that in a fantasy setting. And in our whole campaign, we never had the giant lizards. I kind of forgot about them, but I built the world based on that, and then just kind of forgot about the awesome fantasy lizards. So,
fantasy lizards, I love it. That should be the title of the podcast.
They're fantasy lizards.
Fantasy lizards.
Episode
Encounter
36.
them in Galgathor's Gambit.
Fantasy lizards. There actually are no. The spoiler alert: there are no fantasy lizards in the book. They don't make an appearance. I never got around to them. So,
well, you know what? It was still a really.
The name for the. I don't understand why it's their name. They're called rock monitors in real life. Like that's the scientific term.
Rock monitors?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I guess they're still around, but they had giant ones, like 10,000 years ago or something like that. They were like bigger than a car. They were just like these lizards, but they're called rock monitors. And I was like, that doesn't sound like a science name. Like, I don't understand. Doesn't sound like an animal name. So
interesting. So that's how you came up with the world, yes. Which I think is so interesting. What inspires, world creation, what you can pull from. What inspired some of the characters there?
That's a really great question. So the three main characters, Elias, Iltomo, and Lif, are based on people I know in real life. And then Caligon is based on one of my favorite fictional characters from The Expanse, Amos Burton. So I based her on like a female version of him. And then Mirabella is that's Carrie's creation, as we all know. Mirabella, the outspoken, ready to jump into a fight, awesome halfling who's hilarious. And then I based the character of Jarrah on. Initially, he was kind of like, I wanted to do a fantasy version of Raylan Givens from Justified, But
Okay.
as I wrote him, he quickly became kind of based on my buddy Torin in terms of his personality. And then the character just kind of wrote himself. He really grew from the original origins of what I had for him. And then the character of Shorshaka, I based a little bit on myself, and kind of with her finding her place and finding courage to be who she is and stuff like that. So yeah, that's what I thought she had a cool arc, and I've always loved playing in D&D. I like playing Kenku, which are like the crow people. So I wanted to have my version of them, which are called the Kura people, and they're descended from the great ravens of old. They live mainly in Blackwing City, and they're adept at magic and stealth, and it's fun, you know.
How do you create some of these abilities for the characters, like how they're able to manipulate the world around them or be a part of the world around them? And like how do you keep that sane with multiple characters throughout an entire story?
That, was interesting because there's lots of magic, but there's actually not that much magic in. I mean, it's there. There's people who can do spells and stuff, but it's not the most commonplace thing.
Okay.
And so like none of the main characters. Jirah has like very basic knowledge of like a very specific kind of ritual spell casting to protect people from like monsters in the wasteland. But everyone else, like it's not super common to be a mage. And so they don't, like, when they did encounter magic, I just kind of made up the systems as I went. I didn't really go in with a plan, which is unusual for me, because normally I would go in and be like, this is how magic works in that world, and there's these specific energies and how it manipulates reality, and there's these rules and that rules. And with this one, I was like, I'm just gonna kind of go with what flows, and really see what the plot needs to keep the magic minimal, so that it felt like a more grounded story. Yeah, and so the main character that really only uses magic is Shorshaka. She's able to use magic harnessed from the moon, and so she's only able to use it at night. So during the day, she's just like a tiny crow person, So that's something that she grapples with, is like, am I anything without my identity of my power that comes from the moon? So,
ooh,
yeah,
getting real deep there.
yeah.
That's super cool. I'm thinking of, so like obviously I'm starting my first foray into fantasy writing, and it's been super interesting, like how to come up with characters, create the characters, and how they interact with their environments. Are you I feel like we've had some on this Nerds and Freds podcast, we've had some deliberation of planners versus pantsers.
Yes.
Did you plan out this plot and storyline, or did you fly by the seat of your pants?
I tend to outline the plot points.
Okay.
And then, so I'll have it in each chapter. I'm like, this has to happen, this has to happen, this has to happen. And that's it. So I'll usually write 1 to 3 paragraphs for each chapter in my outline. And then when I'm actually writing the chapter, I kind of, it's a mix, I kind of see if it goes down a different rabbit hole, I'll kind of let it go down there and then swing it back around to whatever, things have to happen there. But being a dungeon master in D&D has helped me a lot, because like when I plan things for you guys, I have no idea where you're going to go with it or how you're going to approach it. So I'm like, okay, if I want these little milestones to happen, they have to be flexible milestones, where it's not saying something exact has to happen. Just like, okay, I want to challenge the party with whatever, and seeing how you guys approach it, and then saying, well, if they decide to go to this totally different area that I couldn't expect, how am I going to take that milestone and make it happen where they're going? So that's been really helpful for me to not get too reliant on my outline, to where the characters can interact and grow organically as I write, but it still serves as giving a structure and signposts as I go.
Interesting. So you mentioned being a dungeon master. So the campaign that we're playing that sets place inside this similar world, what's been like the biggest surprise from the players that you've had to quickly adapt and try to like adjust, where you want that campaign to go?
That's a really good question. When I first started the campaign, I had a bunch of the northern cities really fleshed out and had like each city had their own quirks and their own unique cultures and things that you would encounter if you went there. And then everyone was like, we're going south. And I was like, no, like those are the boring cities. I don't have anything for those yet. So I had to come up with stuff. But, and then it's funny, I ran the same campaign 5 more times with different groups of players, and everyone
5?
always goes south. And I'm like, no, you go north, you go to Carl City, you don't go to Grayspire. And so but every time everyone likes to go to Grayspire. I don't know why. So,
interesting.
yes,
So
they always want to go south from the starting position.
So does the book take you north?
Yes, the way
okay, so you finally got the
yes.
relief of being able to tell the story of the north.
I did, yes, and it just hints at the southern cities that I actually ended up developing them more, except for Grayspire. That's always been my one that my players love to explore, and I'm like, I don't have that much cool stuff for it, so it's like my weak city, very bland medieval city, you know. But,
that's funny. That's funny. So when you have these D&D campaigns that are going on at the same time you're writing a book, or at the same time you're pulling from the book, does that impact, like, did you already have it outlined in the way that you wanted it to go from a book perspective, and then took some inspiration from these campaigns, or did any of these campaigns end up changing what you wrote in the book?
So really, I had the book outlined already. And I knew where the characters were going to go and what events were going to unfold. So when I played it with you guys, of course you went totally different trajectories, which was awesome. And so, I took Mirabella from the campaign because I really liked your character, and I saw she doesn't come into like halfway through Galgathor's Gambit,
right?
Because I saw a need for a really badass character, and I was like, hey, we'll put Mirabella in there, but and because it makes sense that she would be wandering the wasteland when she shows up, because she's like going on her Taz walkabout, which is the sleepwalking is what they call it, because their religion is the Sleepwave that I made up, which I just chose that because there's a cool band out there called Sleepwave that has like one cool album, and I dig their music, so I was like, that's gonna be the religion, and deals with like dreamscapes and stuff like that. So yeah, I sprinkle little random references in here and there, so.
That's hilarious. I've always eats for fun. I've always been curious, like how people come up with names, how people come up with, because your book goes like, it has different names of lands, names of religions, names of characters, of races. Like, how are you able to come up with these, but then also keep them like semi-cohesive?
That's a good question, because I started out when I was world building Tazralia. I built I think I have like 15 pages of like Taz vocabulary and like the language and runes in their alphabet, and I never used any of it. It just helped me with the world building. But I came up with different species like the Kura and the Balauran. And then in Exile into Sand, I have the Torbeck and the Ishigel and the Nelpazar and the Genpazar. I just kind of memorized them. I think I have a list somewhere on my computer, but I just kind of, you
just pull from.
Yeah, I guess originally I had a list of like 35 species for Exile into Sand, and I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to introduce all of these different cool species with all of their different quirks and things, and they'll all have their own culture and religion. And then I was talking to someone, and they were like, don't, dude, it's too much. And I was like, you're right. I started reading a book by an author I really like, called The Dragon's Path, and he had 13 like races of man that were all very distinct. And it was it was too much to keep track of, and I was like, I'm gonna dial myself back a bunch. So that was kind of the trajectory of that. So like, for instance, like, it's going back to your D&D question, it's fascinating because like, actually I did take one encounter that your character Asher went on in that haunted castle where you guys fought the Striga from The Witcher. I took that and made some adjustments and used it with a character in Galgathor's Gambit. So that was an inspiration on how that turned out. I was like, I need to include that as like a side quest adventure that they go on. But if you recall too, they had in the D&D game, we had the whole big pirate ship called the Taciturn Fortune. None of that made it into the book, and I was like, that was just an awesome thing that happened organically.
Is that something like as a writer? So obviously, like you've completed the book, which is awesome. Congrats on that.
Thank you.
Is that something that you plan to like continue within the world? Like, are you planning additional books and stories within it that you can pull from additional campaigns that you've done?
Yeah, actually. So Galgathor's Gambit, and this is going to be spoiler free because I'm talking about things that our listeners are going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? Where you are in the campaign right now is a little bit past where the book ends.
Right.
And so kind of what you guys are coming up against soon, which will leave nebulous, is going to happen to the book. I'm just curious how the characters are going to deal with it for future books. Because I'm kind of curious to see how your characters deal with it as we kind of wrap up that campaign.
Yeah.
We're going to do it like Mass Effect style, where it's just going to be like I'm going to just write out what's happening and get the occasional impact from you. It'll be like a giant cutscene,
Yeah. Yeah.
But it'll be a lot more detailed when I write it for the sequel to Galgathor's Gambit, which a Galgathor's Gambit is a to be continued type of ending, so there is room for a sequel. And I haven't really started outlining that. I'm still working on my third novel, which is called The Owl and the Eagles. So I'm about a quarter of the way through writing that. And to help flesh out that world, I made a campaign that you are in, playing an awesome character named Bristol McCoy. And so that campaign is still early on, and I'm still early on in the book. So you guys are actually ahead of where I am in writing it. But with The Owl and the Eagles, I went and I actually outlined the whole thing, doing like 5 to 6 paragraphs per chapter. So I have a pretty detailed arc already. And sorry, there's someone honking outside my house. I live right by a busy intersection, so it's not at me, it's not at my house. But yeah, no, because I have the trajectory already lined up for the character in the book, I'm just curious where you guys are going to go, because it's I feel like the trajectory is pretty logical to where it's kind of the plot is pushing you forward. But I'm curious to see how you guys differentiate, because I'm sure you will. And I'm really excited for that, especially since in the book, it's about a single character who goes to a fantasy world and is all alone, being from Earth. Whereas you guys have a team of people. So there's that social dynamic that makes it a little different, which is fascinating, so.
Yeah, a little more fun too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
As a campaign, I mean, a campaign with a single person wouldn't be super fun. So
actually, they can be fun. I've done single player campaigns before with like new players who want to try D&D, where we'll do it where it's just the DM and the player. It's actually a really good challenge as a DM, because without the social interactions between players and people debating things and making plans, you've got to be ready to move like quick, because like as soon as the player's like, let's do this, you got to be ready to be like, okay, here's what you encounter. So it requires a lot more prep and a lot more like a lot more improv than regular DMing. So I do it sometimes just to stay fresh as a DM, to challenge myself. So I've ran 3 campaigns where it's just me and one player. Wow. In person, live, not even over text. It's just go for it, So
yeah, I hadn't thought about that, building up the skills as a DM. Is that something like in fantasy novel world as authors, like where they do pull from D&D references?
I'm sure they do. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, are they running campaigns, or are they like, I'm curious if that's a thing among fantasy authors. I don't know if
a lot of the authors we've talked to are pretty avid gamers. Like we had the Ogaras on for, I believe it was episode 33 or episode 32. And they were big tabletop gamers. So that was awesome. We talked about that a bunch. And yeah, so I think a lot of authors are into it, because if you're into fantasy, it's like, this is the best way to play fantasy, is Dungeons and Dragons, so
right.
Yeah, I think it's at least it's popular out in Hollywood with like actors and screenwriters as well. So that's been cool. Like a lot of people I know in the film industry are like, oh yeah, we play D&D. So
sweet. Cool. Okay.
Yeah, it's awesome.
That's super cool.
Yeah. Because it's basically, when you do it live too, it's like acting,
right?
Because you're playing a character,
playing another character.
Yeah.
Super good practice that way.
Yeah.
Well, I've been this has been super helpful for me as a new fantasy writer and a new D&D player, like just understanding how it links and how you're able to pull from these experiences within a game on how to really create a story and have like side quests that always tie back to like what's actually going on with the main story arc. That's super cool.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and I think the biggest thing that I forget where I heard it from, but it was good advice that I'll pass along to you as well, because it helped me a lot. Because I feel like if you look at Exile into Sand, which is my first book, and Galgathor's Gambit, which is my second, I feel like Galgathor's Gambit has a much richer ensemble of like minor characters, and that stems from I got the advice when playing D&D to like if you have a small minor character like an NPC that your players interact with, give them at least one quirk to make them special, and give them multiple if you can, and that just ends up it just kind of as naturally occurs that you have better interactions and more dynamicism between the minor characters and the main characters. So like I've tried to do that with my minor characters in D&D, and then in Galgathor's Gambit, I have like one of my favorites is Captain Yetim, who's a dwarven like commander, and I just made her like she has a super long beard like with lots of like beads in it, and she's just real grumpy and distrustful and like hates her job but loves it at the same time. And even though she's a pretty minor character, I was like, that's just so when she has dialogue with the other characters, I'm able to make it feel more real and authentic.
Yeah, that's something. So I read your first book, and then I read the pre-published version of Galgathor's Gambit, and I definitely noticed that as well. Like the difference in richness of like the story because of the side characters. Like it was really cool to see the interaction that happened. And granted, some of them I can't remember the like exactly who, but I remember there was a side character where like, oh, this is a cool side character, and then like they kind of either disappeared or died or something happened to him, and you're like, oh, like it wasn't even one of the main characters, and you're like, oh, all right, I guess that's what. So like it plays emotionally throughout the story, in addition to the main characters, which I feel like is something that is makes the novel, I guess, more visually appealing, because then you're able to like visualize what's going on with these side characters, which
that's what cool. I was going for. So that's awesome. I love that.
Yes.
That's so cool.
Yes.
Mission accomplished.
Love it.
That's great. Yeah, no, I love when there's ever since I got into Star Wars as a kid, and Star Wars, like even the most minor of characters, I love that George Lucas took the time to give them all backstories, even though most of the time it was like totally unnecessary. But like as a kid, like growing up and like collecting the figures and the cards and like having their backgrounds, I was like, I grew up loving minor characters that have cool flair, where you're just like, I want to know that person's story. So I've tried to reflect that in my writing, which is fun.
That's really cool. Well, and I feel like I haven't done this. I don't even know if this is a thing, but it also sets up the ability for you to create additional stories like down the road. If you ever want to like extend the universe of, what Galgathor's Gambit took place in, you're able to extend that even further down the road if you want to. If you're like, oh, there's really good reception here, then you just take a side character and go deeper into that world in terms of like extending it. So.
Yeah, that's definitely an option with some side characters I got,
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like to your Star Wars reference, like there are definitely some characters where I'm like, I would love to see just a movie on that person, like how they got to where they're at.
With Disney, that's happening. They're doing the minor characters. It's awesome.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
That's great. Well, yeah, man. Well, thank you for so many great questions. I really appreciate it. I think this will be a great podcast to talk about the book, and shout out to our buddy Will for doing the cover art on there.
It looks so good.
I know, right? It's amazing. It's like my new phone background, and I'm gonna get the skull tattooed on me somewhere. Like, I love it. Love it. Everyone who's listening, follow Will Shaw Art. That's Will and then SHAW Art. That's his handle on Instagram and Twitter. Give him a follow because he does great stuff. And look in the podcast description for me and Caleb's info. Give us a follow as well. And check out the Wisdom app if you have an iPhone, because it's a fun time. We'll do a little plug for that too. Me and Caleb are both on there, and we host live podcasts all the time that you can join in on and ask us questions. So that's my sign off. Anything else you want to promote, Caleb?
No. This was great. I mean, I love the Wisdom app as well. It's a super interesting app. And look for my novel coming at some point in the year.
Yes, where I will interview you about it.
There we go. Yeah,
awesome.
That'll be the key.
Oh, I can't wait, man. Well, keep up the good work. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate you.
It was. Thank you, Josh, for the great insight.
Of course. Thanks so much.